I'm Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, interviewing Beck, who's right here beside me. Beck, I sort of wanted to ask you some questions about, where you're from and who exactly you are, and I can't seem to get any straight answers out of anybody who seems to know you, but what exactly is your real name? Is it Beck? Were you christened Beck? All right.
Okay, so let's set the scene here. During a substantial part of the 70s, and much before that, the vast majority of popular music was from artists signed to major record labels, and the existence of such labels was just about the only thing that you could really rely on for popular music. I mean, if you wanted to publish a record without the support of a major label, you could certainly do that, and there are absolutely examples of private pressed records from back in the day that, especially today, have gained a lot of acclaim, but it would be very difficult to call those albums popular, especially back in the time when they first came out. That said, things started to change somewhat substantially moving into the 80s. Throughout the 80s and into the 90s, the popular music scene was inundated with independent artists and bands, and as the music industry grew, so did the opportunity for bands to prove themselves without the need of a major label. Even during the time, major labels, such as the very famous Sire label, started introducing these subsects of independent labels directly attached to them. Very famously, you have the Smiths on Rough Trade as a subsect of Sire. But then you also had full-on independent labels that existed without much, if any, financial assistance or outside assistance from any bigger corporations. The subject of today's video is Sonic Youth, and their first few records were released by Glenn Branca's label, Neutral Records. And the existence of labels such as Neutral Records were truly a fantastic thing for the music industry. I mean, for the first time, you could see smaller artists with minimal corporate backing being able to release their music to a fairly substantial audience. However, then came the controversial aspect and the theme of this video, which is the idea of selling out. So as these smaller independent artists released records through either their own labels or more independent labels, they would gain traction, and as such, some artists would be given the opportunity to sign to a major record label. And of course, now we're in a time where more independent artists are able to release their music. They're probably very glad to have that opportunity at all. But now you're throwing on top of it an opportunity to branch out into an even larger audience. And there's some controversy coming with that, because obviously I think that it's reasonable for the band or the artist to want to pursue this. But then you also have the fan perspective, where you see the more independent side, the niche side of this particular artist that you love, now sort of moving out into a larger scene, and that opens up the door for a lot of points of contention. I mean, after all, you are directly moving away from an independent scene and into a corporate one. And there were fears that bands who had signed to these major labels would take this as an opportunity for mainstream success and to move away from the ideas and the sounds that gained them that initial popularity in the first place. But now let's get back to Sonic Youth. So one thing that we like to do around here is admit our personal biases. Now, I will admit I am not the biggest fan of Sonic Youth's first three EPs, releases. I don't know what you want to call them. I know that the first album is considered an EP. Some even consider Confusion is Sex to be an EP. I'm not too sure. But regardless of what you call them, I am not the biggest fan of those albums, especially in comparison to what the band would move on to create. But then moving away from this concept just for a second, I think that's one of the great things about Sonic Youth, is that throughout their career, they covered such a wide breadth of ideas within their initial predefined sound that you can have someone whose favorite record is possibly Confusion is Sex, while someone else may pick Goo as their favorite. And that's just pretty awesome that a band can be that diverse throughout their career. And now we get into the idea of how I think Sonic Youth in particular managed to evade the idea of being a sellout, the idea that you can be a band like Sonic Youth. I mean, go listen to Confusion is Sex, and now think of that band signing to a major record label. That's a little insane. But the idea that you can do that and still maintain not only your core audience, your core followers, but also attain a level of mainstream success and definitely cultural relevance. And that is the idea of progression without regression. Now, bands can sell out. I think that is fairly widely agreed upon. But I think that the concept of what selling out is a little bit more subjective than perhaps many would like to think. So as an example, I think of selling out as a direct and financially motivated move to create something with mass appeal while neglecting almost entirely, if not entirely, any artistic merit that you once had or would potentially like to have but fear getting in the way of your financial success. However, I think a lot of people think very differently. I mean, sometimes all it takes is a little shift in musicality to accuse Metallica of selling out with their Black Album. But I do see an argument here. It can be difficult to watch a band create something you like so dearly, and then watch them move away from their sound, the sound that made them unique, and then end up creating something much more in line with the general pop mainstream. Though I will argue there's a middle ground here, and a middle ground that few have managed to skate so gracefully as Sonic Youth. But to understand the real significance of what Sonic Youth did, I think that it's important to get some context in here. So let's go back to the beginning. So Sonic Youth released their first record, or EP, not quite sure which, in 1982. Now this was very much an album made in the no-wave vein. No-wave was a style of music that grew out of the New York punk scene in the late 70s that I suppose is sort of a style of punk music, but it kind of neglects the back-to-basics attitude of punk and replaces it with a much more dissonant musicality and cryptic, almost sort of stream-of-conscious lyrics. At least that's what I have found in most no-wave music that I have heard. And that is certainly the case with Sonic Youth's debut. Now, the band followed that with Confusion is Sex the following year, and we already see a little bit of a progression here. Now, the record is far less reliant on instrumentals than their debut was. There's much more sort of song-based, or I guess lyrically based songs in this album than in the debut. And the songs themselves rely less on repetition and much more on creating an almost disturbing atmosphere. Bad Moon Rising then followed that in 1985, and while there is definitely still those elements of repetition and definitely a disturbing atmosphere, the band sort of incorporated a bit of a turn into much more song-oriented writing here. And what I mean by that is it certainly feels like the band is putting more intention into creating individual distinct tracks here, where in the preceding records, the overall feeling of the album as a whole seemed to take precedent. But now we come to what I would argue to be the first absolutely massive shift that happened with Sonic Youth's sound during their progression, and that is the introduction of their new drummer, Steve Shelley. Now, the inclusion of Steve into the band truly changed their sound, and I would absolutely argue for the better. The band became much less of a musically wandering stream-of-conscious effort, and became a much more tight, organized unit. Evil is one of my favorite records from the band, and I would argue this is one of the first times that the band created something this distinct. Every song is very unique from the one that preceded it, and some songs aren't even that far off from extremely easy to listen to. I mean, just go listen to the opening track off this album, Tom Violence, and then go listen to anything from the 3 previous releases, and I think that you'll understand what I mean, and that the band is moving away from this just atmospheric intensity and more into a song-based sound, while absolutely retaining what made them unique, and the disturbing atmosphere, that's absolutely still here. Now, from here, the band moved into an even more structured direction with the album Sister, which I would argue is almost an outright riff rock album. I mean, the record is filled with, I guess, what you would think of as classic rock riffs, at least they sound like it. Admittedly, they're played on some of the most strange tunings heard in rock music, but nonetheless, the band is clearly moving in a more structured, oriented direction. And then comes the big one. Daydream Nation is fairly widely regarded as one of the best albums of the 80s, if not one of the most significant albums of all time. It was the band's first double album, and it takes everything from Sister and dials it up. The songs are often longer here, giving more room for both a groove and space for the songs to develop, as well as an opportunity to introduce their noise rock dissonance among incredibly melodic riffs and vocal lines. Here you have moments of pure rock awesomeness, such as in Teenage Riot or Total Trash, two of, I think, the highlights of the band's career. And then you also have much more noisy, punky, sort of slacker rock tracks, such as Eric's Trip and Hey Joni, and moments of pure beauty and sonic experimentation, such as Providence. Basically, Daydream Nation is the grand statement the band has been building up to, and it isn't much of a surprise that this record gave the band the opportunity to sign to a major label. So let's just think about how the band has progressed so far. You start off very no-wave, very noisy, very dissonant, move into a more song-based sound, develop that song-based sound, make it more, I guess, recognizable as rock music, then go a little bit more expansive with it. what do we see here in Goo? Just a natural progression of what the band was leading to. You don't even need the context of them signing to a major record label to think of Goo as a natural progression from Daydream Nation. I mean, the songs are often shorter than on the predecessor, but that's about the only substantial difference. You got the cryptic lyrics, noisy soundscapes in really well-written songs. I mean, the opening track to this album might be the best introduction that you could have to Sonic Youth. It starts off softer and more, I guess you would call, normal for the band, but as it builds, they seamlessly incorporate their unique blend of melody and madness. And then you have Tunic, which is not only one of the best songs in the band's whole discography, but one of the most lyrically substantial and weighty tracks as well. I also love Moat, and Disappearer is probably the closest thing the band ever came to an outright, straightforward rock song, and I absolutely mean that in the best way possible. But then, don't let that scare you die-hard fans either, because you also have a lot of more challenging songs, particularly on the second side here too. Mildred Pierce is one of those cool jump scare songs where he just starts yelling at you at the end, and Scooter and Jinx is basically just the sound of an amplifier dying, so that's pretty cool. And I'll be honest with you in that the whole premise of this video is sort of a lie, in the sense that I just wanted a reason to talk about Sonic Youth, because I think that Sonic Youth is one of the most criminally underrepresented artists for as culturally relevant as they were, and even still are. I don't see hardly anyone talking about them on YouTube these days, and I think that that's an absolute tragedy. That said, I think that anyone can learn a lot from what Sonic Youth did here. When faced with an opportunity for growth, you don't need to compromise to be successful. Now, sure, Sonic Youth might not be a household name in every house, but they are in just about every musician's. I mean, Nirvana might be the face of the underground 90s scene, but I think even they would have admitted that Sonic Youth were the real leaders in that space. And I don't mean that as a way to diminish Nirvana, I just mean as a way that Sonic Youth were truly revolutionary, and continued to be revolutionary even through signing with a major label up until the point that they disbanded. I mean, even the whole idea of noise rock wasn't anything new in the 90s. It dates back to probably around the time of White Light, White Heat. But few bands have been able to create something as relevant and honestly just fun to listen to as Sonic Youth has. So if by chance you haven't heard Sonic Youth before, I would absolutely recommend Goo as a great place to start with the band. It was the first album I ever heard from them, and the day that I listened to it once, I believe I, not even kidding you, listened to it another 10 times immediately following it. So it's something that I absolutely love. Admittedly, it is probably not for everyone. And that sort of brings me to the idea of how I first started liking Sonic Youth, because other than White Light, White Heat, which is, I suppose, only vaguely comparable to what Sonic Youth did, I had not listened to anything even close to what the band was doing. And admittedly, if you were to define the sound to me and tell me what it was, I would have absolutely hated that idea. And I think that it was just, I had to be willing to open myself up to music that I probably wasn't going to like, to challenge myself. And it worked out great for me. Sonic Youth is one of my favorite bands of all time now. I think that every single one of their records that they've created, even the ones that I don't think are as good, shall we say, or at least as re-listenable as the albums that I think are their absolute best. Like Washing Machine, I love Washing Machine. But even those records are incredibly interesting, and every time that I do re-listen to them, I do find new ideas, new sounds, new ways of connecting to the music that I didn't have before. And so I would recommend everyone go listen to Sonic Youth. I mean, even if you've already heard Sonic Youth, take this as an excuse to go listen to some more, because they're just great. So that's the video. Progression without regression, the idea of selling out without the out. You're just selling. That's pretty cool. Speaking of selling out, subscribe.